All right, it's officially 8:01, so we'll get started. Thank you to everyone for joining us today for EdTech Talk on the disruption of learning. It's our first time doing this EdTech Talk series, but we hope to make it a regular event happening quarterly, virtually, and then maybe even in person at some point. If you're unfamiliar, the Iowa EdTech Collaborative is led by the Iowa City Area Development Group in collaboration with many partners throughout the state of Iowa. We're on a mission to help grow human-centered K-12 higher education and lifelong learning across the state. We have many initiatives and events happening this year and encourage you to stay up to date on our happenings by following us on social media at EdTech Iowa and checking out our website, edtechiowa.com. First, some housekeeping items. We want this to be an engaging discussion and encourage you to ask questions. We are reserving the last 20 minutes of today's session for audience Q&A. If you have questions at any point during the discussion, we encourage you to pop them into the chat and we'll try our best to answer them during the Q&A session. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jenny Schmidt, who is joining us today as our featured moderator. Jenny is an associate professor in the education department at Mount Mercy University, where she works with training pre-service teachers and heads the university's Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning. Jenny worked as an elementary and secondary teacher in public and private schools in the Boston area and at Scattergood Friends School, where she still lives with her partner and family. Jenny's teaching and current work focuses on both progressive educational approaches to schools and issues of equity. In the 90s, these two interests were combined through her work with Bob Moses and the National Algebra Project, working to implement programs and policies that remove barriers to BIPOC low SES student participation in algebra in the 8th grade and the college preparatory track through high school. At the heart of the work she does is a deep commitment to supporting the work of educators seeking to create school communities in which all children are seen, listened to, and given respectful tasks through which to grow. If she has a tagline, it would be that school should be wonderful. All right, Jenny, you can take it away.
Thank you so much. Hi, I am really honored to be here and I'm excited to dive into this conversation. And so we've gathered a few people that we know are involved in thinking about these things. And we think it's going to be a really rich and helpful conversation. So we want to dive right into it. So I thought I'd have our panelists introduce themselves first, and I'm going to ask them to respond to this prompt, briefly respond, and then we'll dive into the questions. So a recent Washington Post headline said, "A year of the pandemic in America, sorrow and stamina, defiance and despair." So I thought it'd be interesting if folks could introduce themselves, say what your connection to education is, and what words would sum up the last year for you in your role as an educator or someone working within and around education. So why don't we start with, first one on my screen is Sam Taylor, and then you can pass it off.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. So I am the academic dean at Scattergood Friends School. Scattergood's a small progressive college prep school about 8 miles east of Iowa City. It's a boarding and day school, 6 through 12. Yeah, I'm the academic dean for the last couple of years. This is my 16th year at Scattergood. I've primarily been a classroom teacher, teaching both English and math classes. My words, I think challenge, innovation, exhaustion. And I will pass it to Missy, who's next on my screen.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. I'm Missy Forbes, the Executive Director at 4Cs, Coordinated Community Childcare, and we advocate for quality, affordable childcare in our community. I'm also the co-chair of the Neighborhood Nest program, which was an answer to, or a collaborative that got together to address how we were going to help support at-risk students in the online learning model of school. My mission and drive became about equity in education. So I think that the words that would sum up my role over the past year is that connector of resources, an identifier of solutions, someone who just doesn't believe that the answer we tried is good enough, and someone who is driven to continually engage the community and our municipalities to identify opportunities where we can ease the burden of the school district in regards to traditional models of student support. And I know that was a lot of words, sorry.
That's great. Bennett?
Sure. Thanks for having me this morning. I'm glad to see you all. I'm Bennett Brown. My career has been split between classroom teaching in STEM, grades 7 to 12 mostly, with a little bit lower, a little bit post-secondary, as well as instructional design. This year I was teaching primarily at Southeast Junior High, both online and in a hybrid model. That's in Iowa City, the 5th largest district in the state, and the most diverse middle school in that district. I wrote the computer science principles course for Project Lead the Way, another computer science principles course prior to teaching at Southeast, and this year transitioned back to outside the school systems, working with the founders of Trilogy Education, which was a large EdTech sale last year, helping them explore the college engineering space in an online environment.
And Rachel?
Oh, my words.
Oh, your words. Sorry. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, I forgot. So I've really been interested in the last year to see what opportunities we might have with remote education, where it might be better. What might be better about remote education than in-person education?
Great. Thank you. And Rachel?
Hi, I'm Rachel Damaris. I have been an educator in some way, shape, or form for about 20 years. I began my career in science and children's museums across the state of Iowa, working with populations age birth to 100. Then I returned to the classroom, where I spent about 7 years teaching 5th and 6th grade at Willow Inn School in Iowa City, which is a small private school. And I am now, for a complete code shift, teaching at one of the largest middle schools in the state of Iowa. I am at Prairie Point Middle School in the College Community District. We serve about 1,300 students aged or in grades 7, 8, and 9. So I am a core subject teacher there teaching science. And my word would be adaptability.
Awesome. I love that. This is so fun. Yeah. And I guess I could throw my words in. I think I was thinking actually renewal. I found it really kind of pushed me, even though I think of myself as an innovative person, amidst all the stress, it really brought a great sense of renewal. And similar to Bennett, like, I'm curious to see where it will go. So let's dive in. All right, Rachel, I thought I'd start by asking you to start the conversation with thinking about kind of exactly just that. In which ways might our thoughts and conceptions about what it means to teach and learn shift as a result of the past year?
Everything about who I am as a teacher is about that face-to-face experience with kids and having experiences. So I mean, I'm primarily a science teacher, and I'm such a believer in science is a doing subject. It is not necessarily a reading subject. And it's very challenging to teach a doing subject virtually. When you cannot get materials in students' hands safely, when it is simply impossible to have enough materials to get those out to your thousands of students at once. So for me, it has been a complete shift in the way I think about presenting material, from shifting that one-on-one conversation to a structure that works online. Speaking through video. Like a year ago, it would have been very unusual for us to have this conversation all sitting in our little boxes on a computer screen. And now we're doing it today as something that feels completely normal. Again, there's that adaptability, right? We all know how to adapt and adjust and become different kinds of learners. So really, it has forced me back into a learning position in a way that I think is benefiting my students, because it's giving me renewed empathy for what they go through every day. Like, I don't like this structure. I don't like the restraints we have on us right now. How can I flip that over and make it something positive that I can use?
Excellent. Do others want to chime in on that?
I could talk for just a second. I think that one of the things that, one of the sort of easy defaults of in-person teaching, especially for relatively experienced, relatively charismatic teachers, is to just, you can take some days where you don't really prepare that much and don't really think about the student experience, and where you just kind of know, like, I kind of know what I want to teach them. I'm gonna kind of walk in here and like do my show, and maybe that's going to be a day that is a little more lecture-y and a little bit less students actively doing to learn, and it's going to like kind of work. And I think that that over Zoom, that just simply does not work like that. That may be default for some people. And so I think what it's shown me, and I think some of the teachers I mentor here at Scattergood, is just like, it's kind of asking us to really live our values. Like we say that we're a school that really centers like student inquiry, student action, student creation of knowledge and of art and products and writing and whatever. And I think that is hard, but also possible over Zoom. But it's really not possible to just kind of like lecture entertainingly over Zoom. I mean, maybe some people can do it, but it's much harder. So that's just one thought I have about how it's sort of forcing me and us to really live up to our values, I guess, and rethink about how we teach and learn.
Yeah, I think when I think about my own sense of renewal, I feel like it pushed me to be more in line with exactly what you're saying there, Sam. Like I knew about flipping my classroom and things like that, but I never did it. And then when it's like, well, no, I'm not going to sit here and make you sit on Zoom listening to me, I started doing mini lectures. And now it's just renovated the way I think about my faith, because we've been hybrid up at Mount Mercy. So then I'm like, okay, the day I have them in class, like if I'm going to ask them to come to campus, like, what is it that's worth being together for? And everything's just become much more rich, and it just kind of pushed me to a higher level, even though at first it seemed like this huge crisis that was happening with my teaching, or with schools. I think it's really so much better, and I find my face-to-face time is even more like, I like to think I wasn't wasting their time before, but I feel like it's much more focused on me thinking like, what are the really big misconceptions that we need to muck about with while we're face to face? And I think I'm just feeling much better about it. And even when we get the all systems go to be face to face full time next year, I think I'm still going to envision more of a hybrid model, just really thinking through like, when do we have to be there? When don't we? So on a similar note, and anyone can jump in, Sam, I thought we'd start with you. When teaching and learning pivoted to that all online platform in last spring, and continued for many of us in a hybrid or all online platform this fall, what were the specific challenges to creating that human-centered, or I like what Rachel says, that doing-centered classroom that didn't just, because it isn't just about like, here's the content, go take the module, see you in a year. So what were some specific challenges to creating and maintaining that human-centered classroom, and how were they met? And then what just do you feel like couldn't be met, or what might have, if we were to keep going like this, like what might have helped, what could have helped?
Yeah, I think for me and for us at Scattergood, I think we really learned like a few of the challenges. Like one is just the importance of really just like those informal moments in a classroom, like the 3 minutes before you get started where you're able to like make a joke or ask a kid how they're doing, or the 4 minutes after class where you can pull a student aside and say, hey, I really noticed you didn't seem to be engaged. Like, is there something going on? And just even in the classroom, like there's a lot of like, obviously we all know this, right? Like body language and like little side jokes and comments that just like make it feel alive. That is, I think, flattened out a little bit online. And I think that just a huge challenge has been engaging with the social emotional lives of our students. I think we're all realizing how much like school is not just a place where you learn, even facts, but even like also skills, and like it's also a place where you learn how to be human, and I think that's harder remotely. And And then, I mean, I think another challenge is just like having a discussion, having a lively discussion. There's so many more, there's already barriers when you're working with young people who are shy and going through all sorts of things in adolescence, and like, how do you get them to just like be vulnerable or share like an opinion or take a risk in a classroom? And so that's most of what teaching is, I think, from my perspective, is like helping them take chances and not be afraid of failing. And it's so much harder over Zoom. I mean, like, okay, there's a mute button, there's your face on the screen, there's like all these reasons to just hide. And so I think those are some of the challenges. And then, you know, how did we meet them? I think just like really thinking about that social emotional piece and trying to engage with it. Part of it was just trying to create, when we had to go straight in March, like, okay, we're not here anymore. Really trying to create outside of class, like social emotional times, like make sure we're still getting together for our daily times together and stuff outside of class. I think a lot of teachers figured out like taking like the first 5 minutes to just chat in breakout rooms about something not related to your class was just a really helpful way to get people warmed up. And I do think a big challenge for a lot of schools and has been just like getting students to like have their screens on. I know that seems like kind of a small thing, but I think just like having like people be human beings in a room. And I'm not trying to call people out here. Like you guys are probably like eating breakfast and stuff. It's cool. But you know, actually a funny thing about, and I think a challenge too is just like that Zoom fatigue, which greatly I think comes from like when you're sitting in a classroom, you're not also like looking at yourself. You don't have like a mirror of yourself there while you're like talking to other people. And I think for especially for students with anxiety or for marginalized students, it's just like a thing there. It's like reminding you of like whatever thing you don't like about yourself. So actually that was a trick we've been really trying to make widespread at our school, is just turn self-view off, which I'm doing. And Jenny sent me a helpful text when I was introducing myself, like, yeah, your face isn't really on the screen, Sam. I was like, oh yeah, my self-view is off. So that was one of the like small things. But okay, that was a lot of things, some of the challenges, but I'd really be interested in what other folks have to say on this too.
Yeah, do other folks want to chime in, particularly about successes over those challenges, things that have worked? I'd be interested. Missy, it strikes me that the nest itself is a success in the face of a challenge. I don't know if you want to explain some more about what went on there and how that might connect to taking on some of these social emotional issues. And
yeah, so one of the first conversations that we had as a group is because it was just such a broad thing, we didn't know what we were doing. And so we really we wanted to tackle 3 issues. School takes care of childcare, takes care of our academics, and it takes care of our social emotional learning. So we focused on setting up these micro hubs of learning that kind of would address those 3 things. And the United Action for Youth is a nonprofit in Iowa City, and they kind of took that social emotional piece. So they had a drop-in socially distanced safe practice, no more than 10 kids. You had to pre-register and to kind of address that piece. And it was, I think, kind of successful, but then our numbers started to spike. And again, one of the problems was like this back and forth online hybrid shutdown, you know, and so we had a lot of challenges with that. But I think that the one success is that we were able to have these small places of learning where we could keep eyes on kids and we're able to address issues as they were to come up. And another great thing, speaking of Open Heartland, is that there was I think a West High student who would go to that particular nest, and he started actually helping the elementary school kids. It's a really clunky platform to learn, and he was helping those kids and families. And so I think he has a little bit of a new perspective of what he might want to do in the future. Also, it was so in those micro hubs there were places to connect. So, but that was a piece that we did want to address.
anybody else want to chime in on that before we go on? Any successes? Rachel and Bennett, I know you had successes, but no one
I think sometimes people tend to focus on the limitations that come from using a particular tool, like we're in Zoom, and the mention that students don't have the opportunity to socialize with each other as much. Actually, that should happen more, because Now I could be able to click on somebody's face and say something to them. My mic would only go to them. It wouldn't disrupt my neighbors. The teacher shouldn't be upset because I'm not disrupting class. Especially if I'm on topic, normally, you have to balance the distraction versus the help that student is offering to their neighbor. You have to guide the whole classroom together. And here we could theoretically have much more interaction with our peers. And as an example, right now, we have yet to gather information about what you all do. And in 30 seconds, so, type your title and organization or something about your work, a descriptor in the chat, and we could see all of that. I'm going to post a question in chat there saying basically what it is that I think are some of the advantages, namely that in chat, even in this lousy tool that's designed for meeting rooms, we could get full participation. I think full engagement is much more possible with remote education. Here are 3 tools that are alternatives to Zoom, or in the case of Pear Deck, I see Michael here. That's a great tool to use in conjunction with Zoom, and promotes full engagement in a way that we really were struggling with in the classroom because it requires technology. And until technology is required by the classroom itself, it's hard to ask all students to be participating through their computer when they're in person.
Bennett, that's really helpful and amazing, and immediately has my mind going in a lot of directions, including something I hadn't been thinking about is, so I do teacher training, and we watch a lot of videos of great teaching, especially in the last year when we weren't allowed into the schools for much of the year. And we've started watching them, even though I normally wouldn't watch a video in class, I'd have them do that at home alone. We've started doing it in class so that we can simultaneously, we're like back channeling, like, oh, did you see the way she did? And now there's other tools on there like Edpuzzle where they can do that virtually. And that's a great example of like, that is much better. Or just, I've learned, I was always so focused on, I don't want to spend time passively watching a video in class, but then for me to even in the chat to be like, did you just see how that teacher seamlessly, redirected that misunderstanding? Just really powerful. So that was the next question actually for you, Bennett, too, is, so what about brick and mortar? Where are we now? Does it underscore the need for brick and mortar, or how does it blow open the whole idea of what school means? And I'm gonna ask Bennett to
myself,
start.
I think we're all still exploring that. I think technology presents alternatives to brick and mortar, but I also think it presents augmentations to brick and mortar. And I don't think our tools have really evolved much in either of those circumstances. Pear Deck is one of the best examples I know for both. And Aula and Engagely, the other 2 links, those are alternatives to Zoom, but I think that they're still, in a capitalist society, people are building out tools only to the extent that they're profitable. And that engages all sorts of other questions about, well, what technology do people have in hand? What are they used to using? What are they willing to use? And that's pretty far from what's possible, what opportunities are presented. So I think it'll be a while actually before we are able to sort out the role of brick and mortar in a technology enabled environment.
That's a really great point. As we sort that out, can you talk some more about what kinds of technologies do you envision moving towards and away from? Or where could you see this going? If we were to move away from brick and mortar, what kind of tech do we not have yet?
Well, I named an example of a user interface tool where I ought to be able to have a private conversation easily without waiting 20 seconds to drop into a breakout room and then being unsupervised. The teacher ought to be able to have all the things that they usually have in the classroom, where I can be focused on one group but still have an ear and an eye on everybody else, and they still have access to me, audio, visual, as well as through text. So I think that what we need is more exploration of that space. And I feel like I didn't answer your question really.
No, I think you did. Thank you. And others can chime in too. Like,
I think the one thing that we have to always be mindful of, though, is that we are, and when Bennett talks and when we think about like not brick and mortar or doing more technology and online, that there's still people that don't have access to the kind of bandwidth and the kind of technology that we all operate under. And so I think that when we talk about not having a brick and mortar school, like we saw that there were families that we had the resources for them. We had funding for them to go to a different location for online learning, and those didn't connect. And so I think that we need to be really respectful, or I mean, not respectful, that's not what I mean, but mindful of the fact that sometimes for some families, for some students, it has to be that hands-on, face-to-face at a building learning. And so, I mean, as we move forward, obviously we are a technologically based, you know, it's the wave of the future for sure, but we've got some infrastructure that we need to change and address before we have before that really can be equitable for every student. So.
And if I could piggyback off of what Missy just said, like I teach in a district with very high need students. College community spans every possible SES status. We have students who are living in shelters and are homeless. We have students who are extraordinarily wealthy. So we have plenty of students who thrived in online learning because for them, it was just a slight culture shift for the classroom. But I also have students that essentially lost a year. We lost them for a year because between the lack of internet, the home life that's not conducive to sitting and being in online classes for hours at a time. I unfortunately still have students living in temporary housing because of the derecho. It's very real that there are students who are always going to need a brick and mortar school. We need to get them there in person so that we can make sure they are being fed and seeing safe adults. And there's so much more to it than simply the academic learning that takes place in the schools. We really are, for some families, the heartbeat of their childcare on so many different levels. So, and yes, even with eighth graders. I teach eighth graders and we are still 100% doing basic care every day for some families. And that is said with all respect and courtesy. There's just very real barriers to success for some students. And we have to see some of those kiddos in person because we can't access them through the internet.
I think it can be kind of a both and question. I don't think Bennett was saying no more brick and mortar schools. What I heard him saying was like an augmentation of, and also I was thinking about like, how can we use technology to actually reach and augment the education of students who are right now not getting an equitable education?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to go back to something, Missy, you said earlier, like the 3 functions of school, right? And you can help me out. I don't want to misquote you, but do you want to repeat those in your own words?
Yeah, so here's what the school just inherently provides: childcare, food, academic support, and social emotional support. And I don't think that moving forward, we should allow that it should go back to that norm, because that's a lot for a primarily educational space to have to cover all of that. And so what my drive is kind of to be like, how can we engage the community and our municipalities to pick up that lift moving forward? So, you know, should we have to shut down again? What do we do now about childcare or feeding people and things like that? So, but those are, I mean, that was quickly recognized that these are where everyone's panicking, these 4 different things. And so how can we address that as a community?
Yeah, I think that's such a good thing to think about. And if you look back at the history of how we got here, you know, school used to just be the 3 R's, you know, or the 4 R's, whichever you want to say. And then there's a great list out, and I'm totally blanking on the name of the man who did it. He's the blueberry ice cream man. Anybody can help me out there, where he just, and I show it to my students every year, like, you know, in 1890, we added this, and in the year two, you know, in 1900, we added this, and it just grows and grows and grows. And the academic part ends up often being the smallest part. And I wonder what's going to happen with that whole conversation, because even I think the general conversation about like schooling, remote schooling still focuses on the issue as if the only transaction happening is the reading, writing, and arithmetic. And so how do we front and center the conversation that school really plays such a big role in all those areas? And how might we re-envision schools that way as well? I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that. Or if you were in charge of the world, you know, where would we go? It's kind of one of my favorite questions, right? If we were to restructure it, what might it look like from what you've learned?
Are you addressing me? Or
Anyone?
I'm
No, anyone
not the
on panel.
educator.
I'm not addressing you. I know it's hard to look at somebody. No, just anyone. I'm just wondering, like, given what you know now, where are we? And if you were in charge of the world, like, where would we go from here? I mean, I think a lot about like what Missy just said about the student from West. I mean, another thing that why we're age graded has nothing to do with science or brain development or anything. It's because people in the 19th century thought that sounded really efficient. And so, and that you could say like, and in this grade, you'll cover this, and in this grade, you'll cover this, and in this grade, you'll cover that. But really, if you look at how learning happens outside of classrooms, it's much more social and ungraded. And what are some, yeah, just like, you know.
So we've had a lot of conversations in the NEST discussions about project-based learning, but I think it's tricky from what I know, very little, because I'm not the educator. And maybe you guys can speak to this a little more clearly, but it just takes a long time for new curriculum to kind of become okayed by the state. So I don't know. I mean, I think there is a lot of room, especially after the pandemic, for innovation and teaching differently than what school looks like for sure, and how the community can support the things that school really shouldn't or hasn't, you know, like the academics and things like that. But I think that there's a lot of things that need to change up here before we can change anything here.
All right, that Rachel, I see you nodding your head, so I'm not going to cut you off.
I was just going to say, if you're going to let me envision my dream school, which I think every teacher in here could talk about what their dream school would be. If you're letting me blow the walls out and start fresh, we get rid of age grouping because children do not necessarily develop at the same pace or have the same interests. And we really start using our school time for truly critical tasks. I think I've always been a teacher who's intolerant of time wasters. And unfortunately, there's a lot of time wasting when you, sorry to tell all the parents in the crowd that, unfortunately, it's true. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. We try really hard not to let that happen. But if we are following kids where they need to go, if we're meeting them where they are, and giving them truly meaningful tasks, then that time wasting goes away. And I think the way to do that is to, give them thoughtful, meaningful work to do that benefits their brain where they are. Think about how we work as adults. You know, you don't go to your math class to do your math piece. You don't go to your reading class to do the reading you need to do for your professional job. It's all folded together. And I think when we train kids to think, okay, this is my math brain, this is my reading brain, this is my science brain, instead of this is my brain, then we're actually doing them a slight disservice. I want them to think about themselves as learners first, and the subject material maybe comes second. So for me, it's all about meeting kids where they are and then pushing them as far as you can take them with their active consent and participation.
Can I just build on that? I just think like so much of learning like infantilizes kids. I mean, kids are infants sometimes, small, but yeah, I mean, while we're blowing up education, I mean, I just think like the people in our schools, the young people in our schools should be doing the real work that the community needs at the level that they are able to do it. And I totally agree with mixed age classrooms. And yeah, I love that story of the high school kid, like realizing like, oh man, I actually kind of like younger kids. Yeah, I just think like giving them real tasks that the community really needs, and then creating mentorships, and just like imagining the school as like a part of the community, just like it's like a part of how we raise our children. I realize we're getting a little bit away from the like tech side of this, but I mean, but I think it connects, right? Like if we're talking about mentorships and like apprenticeships, you know, the ability to like zoom in someone from anywhere. You know, we have a student who's passionate about, I mean, like people just like in their normal adult jobs wish they could be with an excited 12-year-old and like for half an hour a day or something, you know. And I just think that would be amazing to have more connections between school and the world, because when I see my students come alive, it's when we start doing something that matters in the world.
So building off all three of those is this idea, and I'm seeing it in the chat as well, as how does that innovation happen? And so I'm going back, and you know, Missy had said like it takes a long time for things to come down from the state. That's another thing that maybe can be blown open too. Like teachers have no agency now, but again, that's just a construct. Like, and one thing I'm really interested in exploring, and I'd love to hear from those of you, what you've experienced, like to what extent did teacher agency, like when we were all sent home to just like make it work, all of a sudden there was no state mandated curriculum. Like what happened in those spaces? And particularly I'm thinking Rachel and Bennett, who were in public spaces. And just because Sam, I know in Scattergood teachers have a lot more agency, but what I think that's one of the things that got blown open too, is all of a sudden, you know, where I was talking to a principal a week ago, and he was saying when he first sent his teachers home, he's like, forget the curriculum. What do you love? Build a course about that. And I'm like, that took 1 week to happen. And some of us have been screaming about that for years. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that innovation that could happen there too.
The primary instruction.
Happening. Yeah, sorry.
The primary guidance we were given at the beginning of the pandemic when we were all sent home was to meet kids' needs at the bottom of the triangle first. So just make sure they're safe, they're well, they're fed, do they even have the capacity to engage, and then engage academically. So we spent a lot of social time just checking in, like calling kids at home, chatting with them, making sure they were okay, before any of the teaching could happen. So I was given a tremendous amount of freedom to do what my students needed in that moment. And for most of them, it was making sure they had connections with peers and connections with adults. And then we were able to sneak some science in, and it was meaningful. I taught a lot about virology, honestly, understanding what's happening in our world so that it feels less scary. And I hope it was effective for students.
Yeah, my guess is it felt very relevant and engaging in a way that whatever might be just mandated down doesn't always. Bennett?
Well, I think conversations about the future of education that start with anything related to the pandemic are inherently misleading. I had a chat ready to post so that I'll distract you from my verbal talk instead of somebody else's if you want. But I think that, for instance, if we suddenly had outbreaks of tornadoes every day and we decided we absolutely have to have like tornado shelters that we're putting children in all day long. And then we found out that, wow, when we gather kids in shelters, there's some advantages, like they're seeing each other face to face and they're playing physically in ways that they weren't before. So I'm imagining a science fiction here where education is just remote and we start doing something in person for reasons that are entirely unrelated and undriven by education. And we start out doing all the things that we were doing remotely, but now they're in person and it's kind of awkward and the tools kind of suck because we don't have desks. You know, we don't have any of the things built into the facilities that would make an in-person education comfortable and productive. It doesn't really matter what tools we have right now. Those are essentially inertia from the past. This is a meeting software. This software is for businesses trying to hold a conference room. It's not designed for the classroom. And the things that we're discovering are kind of like the tip of the iceberg of what might be better about remote education, and the disadvantages that we're finding are really not inherent to remote education. If you need face-to-face time, why not put up a map showing everybody's GPS location and have even beforehand, you could pick locations for groups of 5, go meet at the transformer down on the corner here. I mean, obviously that's not going to work for elementary kids, but I think that there are a lot of things that we haven't tried. And what we need to recognize is that there is a lot more that is possible when we are not constrained by the physical location of our body.
So we are officially at 8:40. So if we want to kind of start taking questions from the audience, we have a lot of great questions coming in. Thank you so much for engaging with us today, everyone. Since we're kind of on the topic of like what a classroom looks like, Tom asked, what limits us from moving to the type of learning experience that Rachel describes? How might we incorporate that into the classroom in the future? Does technology have a role in that too? Can it help the situation? Any thoughts from the group on that? Rachel, Sam, Bennett, maybe? Or Jenny too. Jenny, you can chime in as well.
Well, I think, and partly what I might not have highlighted in my bio is I do a lot of ed history work as well. And I think this notion, and picking up on what Bennett just said, is, and there's a historian, and Dan Lordy, who talks about teachers have all had an apprenticeship of schooling. So like we go to school, it looks this way. So then, and I see this in my pre-service work, then they want to come and that's been their apprenticeship, their K-12, and then they just want to learn to do that. And another historian, Larry Cuban, talks about like the grammar, or David Tyack, the grammar of schooling. So just the way we do school, we're still going age graded, bells ringing, divided subjects, that really hasn't changed. If you look at a school in 1890, you look at a school today, though there are exceptions, like the forest schools and, Willow Wind and Scattergood in this area, I would say, are providing the biggest exceptions. Taproot Nature Program, I think, is an outstanding exception. And there may be others that I'm not familiar with. And so I just think, and now I'm losing myself from the heart of the question, I think we need to get in touch with, see if you can go there with me. Like, I think a lot of what's happening with people in white skin is they're beginning to see like, oh, how I see the world isn't necessarily how the world is, right? And I think with schools, we're stuck in that same kind of like, well, that's what school is. But if we ask why, there's not a lot of reasons to back up why we do what we do and how we do it. And one thing I hope is that parents who've been able to be with their kids at this time, a lot of them that I've spoken to are saying like, I didn't realize how bored my kid was. And it's like, and that doesn't have to be, I don't know if that gets at it some, but I think it has to be a really big mind shift about what it is.
Thanks for that, Jenny. Any other thoughts from the group on that question? If not, Michael asked a question, and we kind of touched on this a little bit, but does anyone have any other examples of experiences of mixing ages this past year and how that might have provided a better learning environment? I'm just curious if beyond the nest, if there have been other things that people have heard about that have been successful.
Well, we just started a middle school this past year, which is a really strange year to be starting a program. For 130 years, Scattergood's been a 9th through 12th grade institution, and we started 6 to 8, just a day school. And it's a totally mixed grade experience, 6 to 8. We have moments where students are grouped by their math abilities and that sort of thing. But if you imagine like a sort of youngish 11-year-old and a sort of mature-ish 14-year-old, they're in kind of different places in their lives. And it's been pretty cool to see just by kind of a lot of intentional community building, kind of there's even some kind of just this older sibling, younger sibling kinds of relationships that develop out of that mixed grade classroom. And I just think there's somebody mentioned project-based learning earlier, and I think once you get away from the model of like, we can't have students who are at different levels learning the same subject at the same time because some of them will be bored and some of them will be lost. But when you start really using an instructional model where you just say, what's your curiosity? What do you want to learn about? Present it to your peers in interesting ways that are powerful. You know, a lot of the reasons for having we're really ragging on single grade classrooms right now in this panel, but it does kind of go away.
I'm kind of curious, and this is off script, but you know, a lot of these innovations we're talking about are happening in a private environment. Do you see a path forward for incorporating them into the public school system, or is that just like a big thing that will never get passed? Any thoughts on that? Path forward.
There's a lot of quiet innovation happening in public schools. It tends to be centered around individuals or small groups, small professional learning communities that make the choice to innovate. So it's happening.
Well, that's great to hear. I haven't been in school for a while, so I'm not aware of these things, and nor do I have children. So I'm curious to hear examples of that. Like, Rachel, do you have an example from your schools or something that you've seen that has worked really well, and things that, you know, we might want to grow and go towards in the future?
Right. I think so much of it is administration based. If I don't want to go too far off script here, but so much is administration based, and their willingness to think creatively about how we are meeting the state required standards. I am fortunate to be in a spot where the answer is, if you are helping students learn the required content, go. But, you know, press the pedal, go. That is not the environment everyone is in. So I feel really fortunate about that. There's definitely work that's happening, and it tends to be, you know, the ripple in the pond. When one teacher starts to innovate, it spreads throughout the building because it becomes an expectation from the students. We teach students what to expect in the classroom, not just the content. So if we train and teach students to expect better teaching, then they will begin to ask for it in their own way. They don't always know that's what they're asking for, but when they're telling us, I'm bored, I don't like this class, you know, the question isn't just, or the question the teacher then needs to be asking is why, and how can I make this better for you? And that happens in brick and mortar, that happens virtually. I mean, something that I know I needed to do this spring and this fall when we were fully virtual was consistently check in with students on what's working and what's not. You know, they're our customers, if you want to think about it that way, and we need their feedback regularly.
Thanks for that, Rachel. And Bennett, that's a great point there. What commercial businesses would not share those innovations publicly? Maybe we just need to get the word out there and have these conversations, make people aware that things are happening. We just don't know about them all the time. And Castle, I've heard of Castle. Jenny, you want to chime in there?
Yeah, and I think that that's true. And I think that some of the parting advice I give my pre-service teachers when they graduate is, if you ever have the luxury of choosing who you work for, it will make a tremendous difference. If you're in a building with a leader who's not letting you innovate, you're going to be pretty stuck. I know at Mount Mercy, we have professional development schools. And one of the ones I was involved in creating happened because a teacher told me, well, my principal says, as long as I'm meeting the standards, I can do what I want. I'm like, this is where I want my students. And so I think that innovation is out there, but I also think that we have to pan the camera back too and see, like, we know the answers. Like, if you look at what John Dewey said in the 19th century, and you look at what Neil Postman said in the 60s, and you look at what other people are saying now, it's all very similar to what these brilliant educators are saying. And so we also have to question, in whose interest is it that we don't innovate? And that's sort of my conspiracy theory side of me. Like, I think it's in the interest of the powers that be that we don't innovate, because ultimately children of more privileged families tend to end up in those pockets of innovation for various reasons. Neighborhood-based schooling, the pocket change to end up at a Willowind or a Scattergood. And so I think that we have to look at that socio-political context as well. And there are some people out there, historians, who would say that the election of 2016 was the crowning glory of the American public schools, that they did exactly what they were set out to do. I'm not saying I agree. I just think it's a really interesting thing to think about.
That is really interesting. And you kind of touched on this, but we've got a few questions about how should we engage these pockets of innovation? How do we share these ideas? I know Bennett shared kind of his idea, but does anyone else have ideas of how we can like bring these innovations together and get more adoption of them? Any thoughts? Oh, it looks like Michael. Michael, you want to answer this? I can unmute you. We have Michael introduced himself in the audience here.
Thank you.
Do you have
Can
a
you
thought?
hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. And I don't know a lot of you. I just met Liz recently and Thomas. I think we're connected on LinkedIn. So just to clarify, in my role, we serve more graduate education teachers seeking a master's or principal license. So a lot of you maybe are aware of us, but mostly for grad ed. But I wanted to pick up on Rachel's point, and then Thomas, I think, was the good question about how do we share it, right? I've told Liz that I've been in hundreds of teacher lounges over the years, FaceTime with teachers talking about graduate program opportunities, right? And I hear a lot of things. I told Liz, I think, in a recent conversation, I wish I had a GoPro thing, I could just broadcast it at a moment's notice. Let me just give you a couple examples I hope would encourage you. That this is way pre-pandemic. This is years ago. One was Howard Winneshiek district in North Iowa. They had a mission that their middle school teacher or students would be the most sought after employees in 2025. That was their mission, I believe, back then. And when I visited, they were so proud of it. They took me to several classrooms, and in one classroom, there was the teacher was they were online with a district in Australia or somewhere because they were talking about exotic animals or something. And this is like 5-6 years ago. Another one, Boone United Community. She was so excited that the superintendent there, she took me around, we walked around and said, Mike, you got to see this. And there had to be 4th grade students, maybe. They were given PowerPoint presentations. She said, she asked the student, do you mind if this guest listens in? And so I did. And the young guy, he gave a PowerPoint presentation better than I've seen adults do, great tone, pace, it's happening out there. And I wish now that we, wouldn't it be cool to have like a C-SPAN channel or something that any teacher at any time could just, hey, listen, what we're doing in our classroom. Do you want to see? And just let it run. And if you're an educator, you can just, what do I want to see what's happening today? I don't know. Those things need to be shared to inspire others and promote natural, organic collaborations between K-12 privates, whoever wants to pay attention, So that's my dream. If I could recreate everything, just set up that culture and incentivize, identify value, but all on the sector. So anyway, I hope to encourage everybody. I love being part of this, by the way. I really enjoy. I'm here. I'm learning a lot. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Michael.
I love that idea of eSpan, and I will say that I do think like the Twitter sphere is one of the best faculty development or professional development lounges in the country, and there are pockets of that. I know when Michael was at Pear Deck, I definitely felt there were teachers representing for Pear Deck, and I was getting my best ideas. And if you can happen into the right pocket of people, and there's I'm in a group of critical social studies educators, and we're constantly sharing, like, I did this, did anybody do this? And I think that is a great point. And I think that's a great place to pump up more innovation, because it is happening.
And Matt Arnold asked a good question. How do we give teachers and administrators a safe place to explore, experiment, and innovate? Is it happening naturally? Do we need to create something? Any ideas on that?
I just think it's about time. Like any teacher I know, like their most scarce resource is just time during the day. To innovate, you need time to meet with your colleagues and think about it and prepare it and plan it. And so, I mean, when we say how do we share these things, how do we make them happen? I mean, I think you just have to build in time, and that includes thoughtful leaders, and it also includes the public's willingness to to have more education funding, to hire more teachers, to have more time.
Jenny alluded to this by saying they had their own experience of learning how to teach by being a student. And I think that there are a lot of misconceptions about what it means to be a teacher in a classroom, because every single one of us have also had that apprenticeship. And that experience was either very, very positive, very negative, or neutral, depending on who you are, where you grew up, and what your educational experiences were like. So I think as a result, we have a lot of people who believe they understand the professional demands of being a teacher, but have never stepped foot in a classroom. So I think what we really need are people who truly understand deeply understand the science of pedagogy, that are making decisions about schooling in our city, state, country. Because being at the front of the room and designing the learning experience and supporting students in designing their own learning experiences is not the same as being a student in the classroom.
Joseph asked a good question, we're talking about how educators can lead the innovations, but who else should be involved in this? Are students ever involved? They're the ones that are receiving the education. How do we engage them when we're reimagining what education might look like? This might be our last question too. We're running out of time here, but I want to unleash you on this one.
I guess I'm going to chime in again with the capitalist comparison here. I'm a Bernie supporter, but I also have learned a lot in the private sector here that marketing departments serve the rest of the company and usually get 20% of the budget. So I think we don't ask the people that are working on current iterations of the product to be the R&D department. We don't ask the people that are working on the current innovation of a product to collect customer feedback, analyze it, and invite crowdsourcing of creativity. So teachers are practitioners. I think, Joseph, I love your question. I'll stop there.
Jenny, did you have any thoughts on that? I know you put a comment in the chat there.
Yeah, and I'm really thinking about and love what Bennett just said too about who does it and how, but also I think part of what can be innovated, and I know part of what has happened in my own teaching is why are teachers so busy? And just the way we conceive of, and again, it's literally, y'all might not know this, but a credit is a Carnegie credit, because Andrew Carnegie said, let's chop up the curriculum. And so what it means to know English is to spend this much time doing English at this time. Whereas, so right now I'm involved in a course that used to meet twice a week for 50 minutes. And a colleague of mine and I got together, we had side-by-side classes. We're like, let's divide up the semester. And you get them for 7 weeks for 100 minutes or for 200 minutes, and I'll take them for 7 weeks for 200 minutes. And the whole course is 10 times more powerful because 50 minutes is not a very productive learning chunk. And you combine that with and this you're just gonna do at home, you don't need me, but come in for this 100 minutes and we're gonna play around with this concept. And so looking at that as well, and not to negate, I think also what Bennett is saying, but how teachers are spending their time is also part of this construct.
Awesome. I'm just going to chime in here. We're officially at 9 o'clock. So if you need to leave, you are welcome to do so. And I thank you so much for joining us today for this EdTech Talk. But if you would like to stay, I'm going to remove the security so you can unmute, everyone can unmute themselves. We can have a great continued conversation here. So we invite you to stay on. If you would like to continue chatting, you're welcome to. One thing that I wanted to throw out there with the EdTech Collaborative, if you have ideas of how we can innovate, I invite you to participate in the EdTech Startup Weekend that we'll be hosting a hybrid model of in July. So it's going to be happening July 16th through 18th, and we invite educators, students, entrepreneurs, business people to participate. So stay tuned for more details on that. We'll share it on our social media and website, and we'd love to have some of you there for that. But now I'm going to remove some of the security, and people are welcome to unmute themselves and continue this conversation. Joseph, I know you had something perhaps.
Yeah, to kind of expand on I guess my question was, as we're talking about innovation in the classrooms, and I know I'm not, I worked in the education system for a very short period of time in between transition. I actually do economic development, and some of my focus and a priority of my focus for economic development goes through the K through 12 system and the career training aspects and things. And that's part of obviously the innovation of the education system. And I guess my question and the reason that I asked it is we bring up, the Bennett's explanation on, pulling some of the ideas from the capitalist society and things that will help drive it. And part of that is understanding your customer centric needs and obviously not in the market-based customer analysis, but our students and those parents of those students are ultimately the education system's customers, if you will, and those that we are ultimately trying to seek to service in the best and most direct way possible. If I'm following the path of the conversation, I'm married to an educator, and I have three students who are going through the system as we speak. But I guess my question is, just as we are offering adult education-based classes within my building for extended learning and English language classes and CNA classes, I brought up the idea of just simply a slight schedule change. We offered night classes from 4 to 9. Well, a majority we found, and just in a quick poll in those that were looking to attend, we found that most of them worked second shift. They couldn't attend those classes that we were only offering from 4 to 9. We look at it from the same thing from an innovation standpoint. And what I love about the idea of education technology is the flexibility that it will offer a populace that is becoming more and more unflexible in their ability to rearrange their schedule. We see parents working second shifts, and we know that increased juvenile crime goes between 3 and 7 if they're working first shift and or in between that second shift getting off. How are we asking the right people to be involved in the discussion on focusing on the innovation and change in the education by not, and again, obviously having the frontline, education leaders, and again, like I said, I'm married to one of my sisters in education, but are we asking the right questions of the right people? Are we going to truly get the answers that we want to seek if we don't have, student-based and parent-based, collaboratives? What do the parents want? What do the students want? And I think if we had more of that discussion on the front lines, we may get, some more innovative. And I know that it's not as simple as that, but I guess that's where I was headed from is we can hash out as a, left and right what the problems are, but if we're not addressing or what we think the problem is, if we're not finding who the problem is impacting, can we actually solve it?
I totally agree. And I think that's one thing that, when we shifted to an online learning model, we made a lot of assumptions about how people were going to be able to access that. And Rachel, I loved what you said about, supporting students at the bottom of the triangle, because I think that when we talk about building these online systems and technology and things like that, that's what my drive is. Like, we have to look at what needs or what access do the people at the bottom of the triangle have, and then you build the program. So I think that is a conversation that we have to have. And sending out emails and online electronic surveys isn't necessarily the way to reach those people either. So listening posts at different locations and involving high-level administrators who are making those decisions and things like that, having them there to be able to address the questions that those marginalized populations have is definitely something that we are trying to also drive that conversation too. So, but it's very important and good point.
I think about a friend of mine is a high school teacher in Philadelphia, and what she struggled with is whatever their provider of internet said that will give everyone free hotspot. So everyone will have the internet. But when the students went to go get that, you had to secure it with a credit card. Just like epic fail, you know?
One
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
just really quickly, and I think I don't want to be the person who's saying like, I'll just say it, like students also sometimes are like the most conservative education consumers. Like often I think if you have an innovative idea, the students are the one who have grown up in this particular way of doing school are often the ones who are just like, this is uncomfortable. I don't think I like this. I mean, and when the hubbub around like the new math, whenever that was 10 years ago, and I've found, and can't you just give me a worksheet or just talk to me and I take notes and then I take a test? Like that is much more, that's like in my wheelhouse. So I want to say absolutely, I think we need to listen to what the community needs, what parents needs, what students needs, and with the grain of thought that sometimes people don't know what they want until they experience it.
I would love to build off of that, even though it wasn't the original point I was going to make. I think we've taught kids to expect to sit in a seat and listen and do a worksheet. So when we ask them to do something else, they're really uncomfortable. And they're like, well, no. Let me do the thing that I know how to do and I know I'm successful at. Don't make me get up and talk. Don't make me collaborate with my peers. Don't make me come up with my own idea. I don't know how to do that. So we've almost trained in this learned helplessness. And that's not what we want from adults that are great adults in our society who are going to be difference makers. And that difference doesn't have to be, on the global scale. We're all difference makers on a daily basis in our regular lives, our everyday life. My other thought was simply that education ideally is community-based. And it starts in the family and the extended village of adults and children who care for each other in a community capacity. So, in an ideal world, that we're starting with what Missy is doing, and those are the adults that we are raising through our education system, the ones who, from a very young age, know how to collaborate, work with multiple ages, and overcome boundaries to learn at the best of their abilities.
That in so many ways, schools are really unnatural spaces, and they came about a lot, in terms of what we see today with going back to what Bennett has brought into the conversation with capitalism and crowd control and social control. And it's something I think that needs to get reckoned with to reimagine it.
I like to respond to Joseph's point a minute, just back up a little bit. Like, who should we be talking to, or how and stuff. It's interesting. It's just an observation of how K-12 and private sector, we just don't collaborate, right? For instance, I'm going to a reading conference this summer. There's typically 800 teachers or so, right? There's no one there. You go on, they're all teachers. There's really no private sector folks. There are hardly any. You go on LinkedIn, a lot of conversation about education and stuff, I've actually searched comments and people who like things that are education-based posts, and it's 80% non-educators, not higher ed, not teachers, not K-12 teachers. This is just maybe a rhetorical question. How can we create more opportunities for K-12, all these K-20 and private sector to naturally collaborate on things, in any arena, you know, so to get to Joseph's point is like, you know, people aren't going to listen until we have a relationship going. You know, what's the phrase in education? Students don't care how much you know until they know how much you care, kind of thing. Let's get that going in adult level. You know, like, hey, I really care what's happening in K-12. I'm a private sector leader, you know, and I really care how you're doing, classroom teacher, you know. How can we help each other, kind of thing? How can we learn from each other, you know? Rhetorical question.
No, actually, there's a case study on that exact idea of getting the private sector involved. There's a case study based out of Georgia where an electrical cooperative and the local high school ended up teaming up, and actually it was privately funded through the electric cooperative because they were finding a massive shortage of qualified individuals that were coming out of high school to work for them, and they were having issues with retention, they were having issues with productivity, and they ended up partnering with a high school, and they actually set up, you know, basically in a technology-based education program. And at the time, the graduation rate of the local high school was 87%. And what happened was the electric cooperative said, okay, what do you need from a high school standpoint so that we can work together? And their answer was, obviously we need funding because this is a separate entity that goes away from our 3Rs. So they teamed together, they built an outside facility, but in order to be part of and what they found was a huge interest in you know, the highest dropout rates. But in order to be part of the program, you had to maintain a certain grade point average, and you had to stay obviously in school. And if you accomplished those, then you were allowed to come in, and right away you would start making, you know, a great wage out of high school in that aspect. And it really was somebody who is, as we talk about community based, and it pushes an emphasis on small business and the expansion, because it was a small business that took this to the next level. Now the high school graduation rate is almost 97%. And it happened over the course of about 6 years. It skyrocketed. And that's a prime example of how you can collaborate by asking the right questions and getting those community members involved who are outside of the education realm. I know that I'm not claiming to know, you know, the ins and outs and stuff like that on how the sausage of education is made, but being from the private sector and then having that short stint in the education, there was a myriad of questions that I had that nobody could answer. And again, in my economic development career, you know, that I've recently started, that's where my focus is driving, is looking at involvement with K through 12 through the you know, through trade shows, and it's, you know, it's slow going, but if we can collaborate and get that community-based private sector workforce needs and that aspect evaluating the future of the education, I think that may be where we can get a lot of support. But I mean, that's just, and I will look up that case study. I apologize, it was back from one of my case studies in the grad school, so I will find it and let you know. So.
I think a connection I'm making with that, I'm thinking a lot about international development and just sort of like when NGOs go in, like the case for good intentions versus like community organizing, just start with what do you need? What do you experience? And bringing those people to the table. And I know I sound like a broken record, but I do think there are structures in place that teachers end up least powerful. And how can you, and even student voices, listening to them more. We've really got a dominance of this expertness coming down from above, and those teachers are left out, just like people in other countries are left out when NGOs come in to help.
Well, I have to get hopped off here as well, but thanks again for everyone for joining us today. This was a really great conversation. We recorded this this chat here, and we'll make sure to upload it on YouTube and share it with everyone who RSVP to attend. But look out for many more of these. We want to continue these conversations and really grow innovation across the state of Iowa. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Liz.